Victoria Sterling grabbed the microphone right out of her assistant's hand, walked past 300 stunned investors, and pointed straight at the quiet man standing near the exit. "That man," she said, her voice shaking, "is the reason I'm still standing here." Nobody in that ballroom knew the truth. Weeks earlier, this billionaire CEO had hired a widowed single father to pretend to be her fiancé for one weekend. But between the lies, the cameras, and one storm-locked hotel room with a single bed, the pretending had already stopped being pretend. Comment the city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. Tonight's story is one you won't forget. Damian Brooks had exactly 4 minutes to get from the 12th floor to the executive suite, and he spent every single one of them trying to figure out what he'd done wrong. That was how it worked when you were a nobody in a company built by somebody. You didn't get summoned to Victoria Sterling's office because you did something right. You got summoned because a number somewhere didn't add up, or a shipment was late, or worse, because they'd finally noticed that Damian Brooks, senior operations manager, had been quietly running half the logistics division for 3 years, without ever once asking for the title that came with it. He straightened his tie in the reflection of the elevator doors. It was the same tie he'd worn to his wife's funeral 6 years ago now, because it was the only one that still fit right, and he hadn't had the money or the will to buy a new one since. He smoothed it down anyway, like it mattered. Like anything about his wardrobe was going to change what happened in the next 5 minutes. "You're not in trouble," his co-worker Renee had told him in the break room not 2 hours earlier when the summons came through on his phone. "Nobody gets called up to Sterling's office and fired in person. She has people for that." "That's supposed to make me feel better. I'm saying it's something else." Renee had lowered her voice, glancing toward the glass walls, like Victoria Sterling herself might be listening through them. "Something's going on with her. Family stuff. There's a whole thing with the gala next month, some big announcement they're trying to force out of her. My cousin works in PR. She says Sterling's been locked in her office for 2 days straight." Damian hadn't thought much of it then. Rich people had rich people problems. He had a daughter waiting for him at home, who needed her math homework checked and a lunch packed for tomorrow, and whatever storm was happening 30 floors above him wasn't his concern. Until it was. The doors to the executive floor slid open, and her assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, who always looked like she hadn't slept, was already waiting for him. "She's expecting you," Priya said. "Go straight in." "Do you know what this is about?" Priya's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I wouldn't want to guess." That wasn't reassuring either. Damian pushed open this door to Victoria Sterling's office and found the CEO standing at the window with her back to him, arms crossed, phone pressed flat against her palm like she was strangling it instead of holding it. She didn't turn around right away. For a moment, he just stood there, unsure whether to speak first or wait, feeling like an intruder in a room that cost more to furnish than he made in 2 years. "Sit down, Mr. Brooks." Her voice was flat, controlled. Nothing about it told him whether he was about to be praised or fired, and that uncertainty crawled under his skin worse than either outcome would have. He sat. Victoria finally turned around. She was younger than most people expected a CEO of her size company to be 32 and carrying herself like she'd built an empire out of sheer refusal to lose, because in a way she had. Her eyes were red-rimmed at the edges, the kind of tired that concealer couldn't fully hide, though she'd clearly tried. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to hear the whole thing before you answer, because I already know how it's going to sound. Okay? I need a fiancé." Damian blinked. "I'm sorry. Not a real one." She said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. "A fake one, for one weekend. The company gala is in 3 weeks, and my family, my board, my investors, half the vultures circling this company have decided that my personal life is now a liability. There's a narrative going around that I'm unstable, that I'm too focused on the company to have a real life, that a woman who isn't settled down can't be trusted to run a business this size. It's insulting. It's medieval. And unfortunately, it's working. Our stock dipped 4 points last quarter, after a tabloid ran a piece calling me the loneliest woman in tech. That's..." Damian shook his head slowly. That's not fair to you. No. Victoria agreed. It isn't. But fair doesn't move stock prices. She walked toward her desk, not sitting, just resting her hand on the back of the chair, like she needed something solid to hold on to. My family wants me to announce an engagement before the gala. They've already floated 3 names to me, men I've met twice, men who look at my company like it's a house they'd like to move into. I am not going to marry a stranger to satisfy people who see me as a headline instead of a person. So, you want to fake it instead. For one weekend, that's all. We attend the retreat. We play the part my family sees what they want to see. The story dies and everyone goes back to their lives. Damian sat back in the chair trying to find the trap in this because there had to be one. Rich people didn't hand out favors. They handed out arrangements, and arrangements always had fine print. Why me? He asked. You've got a whole executive floor of people who'd probably kill for a chance to get close to you. Why pick your operations manager? Victoria looked at him for a long moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice had lost some of its boardroom edge. Because you're the only man in this company who's never once looked at me like I was a bank account with legs. The words landed heavier than she probably meant them to. Damian didn't say anything right away. I've watched you for 3 years, Mr. Brooks, she went on. You stay late because the work actually matters to you, not because you're trying to be seen staying late. You never once tried to angle your way into a meeting with me. You treat the janitorial staff with the same respect you treat the board. I don't know a single other person in this building I could say that about. She exhaled. I need someone I can trust not to sell this story to a tabloid the second it's convenient. And I need someone my family will believe actually cares about me because they'll see through anything less. I have a daughter. Damian said like that alone should end the conversation. I have a 6-year-old at home. I can't just disappear for a weekend to play pretend for your investors. I know about Ava. That stopped him cold. How do you know my daughter's name? Because I did my research before I called you up here, Mr. Brooks. I don't make decisions blind. Victoria's expression flickered something almost apologetic passing through it. I know your wife passed 6 years ago. I know you've raised your daughter alone since. I know you've turned down 2 promotions because they required travel, and you didn't want to be away from her for stretches at a time. She paused. That's exactly why I picked you. A man like that doesn't need to be told what loyalty looks like. Damian's jaw tightened. It felt strange, almost violating hearing pieces of his life recited back to him by someone who'd only ever nodded at him in hallways. I'm not doing this for free, he said finally, because pride only bought so much and Ava's future bought a lot more. If I agree, and I haven't, there'd need to be terms. Name them. Ava's college fund, fully funded. Not a loan, not a stipend I have to pay back. And nobody, not the press, not your family, not a single soul outside the people who already know finds out her name or her face. She doesn't exist in this story, as far as anyone's concerned. Victoria didn't hesitate. Done. Both. That was fast. Because it's not a hard decision for me. Money is the easiest thing I have to offer, Mr. Brooks. It's the only thing I have plenty of. Something bitter crossed her face when she said it gone as quickly as it appeared. Damian studied her. 3 years of quiet observation from a distance had told him she was sharp, demanding, occasionally cold in meetings when people wasted her time. It hadn't told him she was this tired underneath it. It hadn't told him that underneath the $1,200 blazer was a woman who sounded for just a second like she was drowning. I need to think about it, he said. I'm not saying no, but I'm not going to promise you an answer sitting in this chair. That's fair. Victoria nodded, and for the first time since he'd walked in, something like relief crossed her face, not because he'd agreed, but because he hadn't said no outright. Take the weekend. I'll need an answer by Monday. The retreat is in 3 weeks, and if it's not you, I need time to find someone else. Damian stood smoothing down the same tie he'd worn to his wife's funeral, and walked out of that office with his head spinning in 6 directions at once. He picked Ava up from Ruth's house at 6:15, same as every day. Ruth had been his late wife's mother, and in the 6 years since Michelle passed, she'd become the closest thing Damian had to a partner in raising his daughter. Not a replacement, never that, but a steady hand he could lean on when the world got too heavy to carry alone. "You look like you swallowed something bad," Ruth said, holding the door open as Ava barreled past both of them toward the car, backpack bouncing. "Something like that." "Bad day." "Strange day." Damian rubbed the back of his neck. "Can I talk to you for a minute after Ava's in bed?" Ruth's eyebrows lifted, but she didn't press. "I'll come by around 8. Dinner that night was the usual chaos. Ava recounting in exhaustive detail an argument she'd had with a classmate over whether dolphins were fish mashed potatoes flung slightly farther than intended, a bath that turned into a splash war Damian hadn't fully won. It was in every way an ordinary night, and that was exactly why the offer sitting in the back of his mind felt so absurd. Fake fiancé, billionaire CEO, a world so far removed from bath time and dolphin arguments that it didn't seem real. He tucked Ava in at 8:15. She grabbed his sleeve before he could stand up from the edge of her bed. "Dad?" "Yeah, baby." "Are you sad?" The question caught him off guard the way her questions always did. 6-year-olds had a way of seeing straight through every adult attempt at composure. "Why do you think I'm sad?" "You did the thing with your face. The thinking too hard thing." Damian laughed softly despite himself. "I'm not sad. I've just got a big decision to make. Grown-up stuff." "Is it about money?" "Sort of." Ava considered this with the gravity only a child could bring to a conversation she barely understood. "Mommy used to say money isn't as important as being happy." Something in Damian's chest tightened. Michelle used to say that a lot, usually right before reminding him that being happy didn't pay rent either, and the two of them would laugh about the contradiction of it, the way love and practicality never quite lined up. He missed that laugh more than he let himself admit most days. "Your mom was smart," he said. "Get some sleep, okay? Okay?" Ruth arrived a few minutes after Ava's door closed, and Damian laid the whole thing out for her at the kitchen table. The summons, the office, Victoria Sterling's tired eyes, the offer, the terms he'd countered with. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, after he finished turning her coffee mug slowly in her hands. "You want my honest opinion?" "Always." "I think it's a terrible idea." She held up a hand before he could respond. "And I think you should do it anyway." Damian frowned. "Explain that." "It's a terrible idea because pretending to love somebody has a way of getting complicated, Damian. You're not made of stone. You go into a situation like that with your guard down because you think it's just a job, and jobs have a way of turning into something you didn't sign up for." She set the mug down. "But I also know exactly how much a full college fund means for that little girl upstairs, and I know exactly how many nights you've sat at this table doing math that never quite works out. So yes, it's a terrible idea, and you should take it. What if it gets messy? What if the press finds out, or her family figures out it's fake, or what if none of that happens, and Ava gets to go to any school she wants without you carrying that weight for the next 12 years? Ruth reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You've spent 6 years making sure that little girl never wanted for anything, even when it cost you everything you had left over. Let something finally give you a little back." Damian sat with that for a long time after Ruth left. He called Victoria Sunday night 20 minutes before her deadline, mostly out of some stubborn instinct to make her wait until the last possible second, though he suspected she saw right through it. "I'll do it," he said when she picked up. "One weekend. Your terms, my terms, nothing changes after that." "Agreed," Victoria said, and he could hear something in her voice loosen just slightly. "Thank you, Damian." It was the first time she'd used his first name. The next 2.5 weeks moved fast in a way that made Damian's ordinary life feel like it belonged to someone else. There were meetings not with Victoria directly, mostly with Priya, who briefed him on names he needed to memorize. Victoria's mother, Eleanor Sterling, a woman Priya described with visible caution as particular. Victoria's older brother, Julian, who ran the company's European division and flew in only for events that mattered to the family's image, and Richard Cole. Who's Richard Cole? Damian asked the first time the name came up. Priya's expression tightened. Victoria's ex-fiancé. Broke it off 2 years ago, right before the wedding. He's going to be at the gala. His family's on the board. There's no avoiding it. He's difficult. Difficult how? You'll see. Damian didn't love the sound of that, but he filed it away and kept moving. There was a fitting for a suit that cost more than his monthly mortgage, which felt obscene in a way he couldn't quite articulate out loud. There was a single deeply uncomfortable coaching session with Victoria in a private conference room where Priya walked them through couple behavior with a clipboard and a completely straight face, while Damian and Victoria stood 4 feet apart, neither one quite able to look at the other. You need to be able to touch each other without flinching, Priya said, not unkindly, just practically. Hand-holding at minimum, possibly a kiss on the cheek for photos. If either of you can't manage that convincingly, this whole thing falls apart before it starts. We're professionals, Victoria said a little too fast. We can manage a handhold, Priya. Prove it. Victoria turned to Damian, held out her hand, like she was offering a business card instead of her palm, and Damian took it. It was for exactly 3 seconds the most awkward physical contact of his adult life. Then, something strange happened. Her hand tightened slightly around his, an almost imperceptible thing, like she was grounding herself against something, and Damian found himself giving the same small squeeze back without deciding to. Better, Priya said, unimpressed. Work on the eye contact. You both look like you're being audited. Victoria laughed a real laugh, short and surprised, like it had escaped before she could stop it, and for a second the whole room felt less like rehearsal and more like two people who might actually like each other. Damian noticed it. He noticed, and he told himself it didn't mean anything. The retreat took place at a sprawling lakeside resort, 3 hours outside the city, the kind of place with private docks and a golf course, and a lobby that smelled like money and eucalyptus. Damian drove up separately, Victoria's idea, so they could arrive naturally, as if they'd traveled together, and simply parked in different spots, and the moment he stepped out of his car, he understood viscerally that he did not belong here. Everyone in the valet line wore clothes that fit like they'd been born in them. Everyone spoke a little louder than necessary, like volume itself was a form of currency. Damian adjusted his jacket, the fitted one, the one Priya's tailor had rushed through in 9 days, and reminded himself that he had handled worse than a weekend of rich people staring at him. He'd handled a hospital room. He'd handled a funeral. He could handle small talk. Victoria found him near the entrance, looking effortless in a way that made his carefully rehearsed calm evaporate slightly. "Ready?" she asked low enough that only he could hear. "Not even a little." "Good! That makes 2 of us!" She slipped her hand into his, the same handhold from the conference room, except this time there was no clipboard, no Priya narrating corrections, just the 2 of them walking into a lobby full of people who were about to decide whether they believed the lie. "Just follow my lead." And Damian, "Yeah, thank you for doing this." "Ask me again Sunday," he said. "I might have a different answer." She smiled at that, and it wasn't the tight, practiced smile she wore in company photos. It reached her eyes. The first hour was easier than Damian expected. Small talk with investors he'd never meet twice, questions about how he and Victoria met, that Victoria fielded with a smoothness that told him she'd rehearsed this lie a dozen times over in her head. "He caught me eating lunch alone at my desk 3 years running, and finally told me it was pathetic," she said to one couple, and the story had just enough self-deprecating truth buried in it because Damian actually had said something like that to her once years ago, in a hallway, never expecting her to remember that it landed as real. It was during dinner that things shifted. Eleanor Sterling arrived, formally trailed by an assistant of her own, and swept Damian with a look that felt less like a greeting and more like an appraisal. She was elegant in the specific brittle way that came from decades of never once relaxing in public. "So you're the one," Eleanor said without preamble, taking the seat across from him. "Damian Brooks," he said, extending a hand. It's good to meet you. Eleanor did not take the hand right away. Victoria has never once brought a man home to meet me, Mr. Brooks. Not once in 32 years. And now 3 weeks before a gala where the entire board is watching her every move she produces you. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Forgive me if I'm skeptical. You should be. Damian said, surprising himself with how steady his voice came out. I'd be skeptical too if I were you. But I'm not going to try to convince you of anything with words, Mrs. Sterling. I figure you'll make up your own mind either way. Something flickered across Eleanor's face. Not quite approval, but not dismissal either. At least you're not groveling. Every other man Victoria's ever brought near this family groveled. She finally shook his hand. We'll see, Mr. Brooks. Victoria, seated beside him, exhaled so quietly he almost missed it, her hand finding his under the table and staying there. Julian Sterling arrived next, Victoria's older brother, flown in that afternoon from the London office, still carrying the faint restlessness of a man who measured every room by how quickly he could leave it. He shook Damian's hand with the brisk efficiency of someone closing a deal, rather than greeting a stranger, then studied him for a beat longer than the handshake required. So, you're the one holding my sister's hand tonight, Julian said, dropping into the seat beside Eleanor. I have to say it's not what I expected. What did you expect? Damian asked. Someone shinier, someone who'd fit the photographs better. Julian's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. No offense. None taken. I'm not much for photographs. Clearly. Julian glanced at Victoria, something more serious moving behind his eyes now. You know this whole gala is a formality, right? The board doesn't actually care who my sister marries. They care that the market stops treating her like a liability because she's unmarried at 32, which is insane, and I've told them so more than once. But insane or not, it's the game we're playing this quarter. I'm aware, Damian said evenly. I'm not under any illusions about why I'm here. Something in his tone made Julian pause. He looked at Victoria, then back at Damian, recalculating. Huh, he said almost to himself. You actually mean that? I do. Most men who marry into money find a way to convince themselves it's about something else. You're the first one I've met who just says it plain. Julian leaned back, and for the first time that night, something like respect settled into his expression. Vic could use more of that around her. Everyone else spends so much energy pretending they don't see the money that they forget to see her. Julian, Victoria said quietly, a warning and a thank you at once. I'm only saying it because I mean it. Julian raised his glass slightly toward Damian, a small private toast. Take care of her this weekend, Mr. Brooks, whatever this actually is. He excused himself toward the bar, not long after leaving behind a silence that felt lighter than the one Eleanor had left in her wake, less an interrogation, more an unspoken blessing neither of them had expected to receive. Richard Cole showed up an hour later, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop the second he walked in. He was tall, polished, the kind of handsome that came with a family crest attached to it, and he made a beeline for their table with the confidence of a man who'd never once been told no in his life. Victoria. He said her name like an old habit, familiar in a way that made Damian's jaw tighten before Richard had said another word. You look well. Rumor has it you found yourself a project. Richard. Victoria's voice went flat cold in a way Damian hadn't heard from her all night. This is Damian, my fiancé. Richard's eyes moved over Damian, slowly cataloging the suit, the shoes, the watch that wasn't nearly as expensive as everyone else's in the room. Fiancé, he repeated like the word tasted strange in his mouth. And what is it you do, Damian, when you're not accompanying Victoria to events? I work at Sterling Technologies, Damian said evenly. Operations. Ah, Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. So you work for her. I work with her. There's a difference, but I wouldn't expect you to understand it. A flicker of surprise crossed Richard's face, clearly not the response he'd been fishing for, and beside him, Damian felt Victoria's hand tighten around his, again this time unmistakably in approval. Careful, Richard said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. Victoria has a habit of collecting men who think they matter to her, right up until they don't. Richard? Victoria's voice cut through, sharp enough to end the conversation outright. That's enough. Richard held Damian's gaze a moment longer, some silent, ugly measuring, before he finally smiled thinly and excused himself toward the bar, leaving a tension behind him that took several minutes to fully dissolve. "I'm sorry about him," Victoria said quietly once he was gone. "He's been like that since the engagement ended. I think some part of him never accepted that I was the one who called it off." "You called it off?" "He wanted a wife who'd fit into board photos and stop working so many hours. I wanted a company." She said it simply without bitterness, though Damian could hear the old wound somewhere underneath it. Turns out those two things weren't compatible in his mind. "They're compatible in mine," Damian said, before he'd fully thought it through. Victoria looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "Careful, Mr. Brooks. You're supposed to be pretending." "Am I?" The words came out quieter than he meant them to, and for a second neither of them said anything at all. Later that night, after the dinner had wound down and most of the guests had retired to their rooms or the bar, Damian found himself walking the resort's back terrace alone, needing air, needing space from a night that had asked more of him emotionally than he'd expected. The lake stretched out dark and still beyond the railing, and somewhere behind him he heard footsteps. Victoria. She'd changed out of her heels, carrying them loosely in one hand, and for the first time all night, she looked less like a CEO and more like a woman who'd simply had a long day. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, coming to stand beside him at the railing. "Too much adrenaline. Your mother's terrifying, by the way." Victoria laughed, quiet and real. "She terrifies everyone. It took me 20 years to stop letting it work on me." She set her heels down and rested her forearms on the railing, looking out at the water instead of at him. "You did well tonight. Better than well. Richard's never once been put in his place like that in front of me. He deserved it." Most people don't say things like that to him. His family's worth more than half the room combined. "I don't really care what his family's worth," Damian said. "I care that he was disrespectful to you at your own table." Victoria went quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had softened into something Damian hadn't heard from her yet. Not the boardroom voice, not the rehearsed fiancé voice, something raw underneath both of those. "Can I tell you something? And you have to promise not to repeat it to anyone, including my mother. You have my word. I used to think being needed and being wanted were the same thing." She stared out at the black water. "Every man I've ever dated wanted something from the company or the money or the name. Richard wanted a wife who photographed well. My family wants an announcement that keeps investors calm. Tonight is the first time in longer than I can remember that a man stood up for me, and I actually believed he meant it." Damian didn't say anything right away. The wind moved across the lake, and somewhere behind them, faint music drifted out from the resort's main hall. "I meant it," he said finally. "I wasn't performing back there. Richard was out of line, and I wasn't going to let it slide just because we're supposed to be pretending." Victoria turned to look at him then, and something passed between them that neither of them had rehearsed with Priya, something no clipboard could have prepared them for. "That's the problem," she said softly. "I keep forgetting which parts of tonight were supposed to be fake." Neither of them moved for a long moment. The distance between them on that terrace felt smaller than it had any right to, given everything true about their situation. His daughter waiting at home, her family watching every move, a contract with terms neither of them had written to cover what was starting to happen between them. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the lake, distant but unmistakable. And within minutes, the wind had picked up sharply enough that Victoria reached down for her heels, glancing up at a sky that had gone from clear to churning in the span of 20 minutes. "That wasn't in the forecast," she murmured. By the time they made it back inside, the front desk was a small storm of its own guests crowding the lobby staff, scrambling between phones, a resort manager repeating apologies to an increasingly frustrated line of people whose scheduled rooms had been rerouted, canceled or flooded by a storm system that had turned violent faster than anyone predicted. "Ms. Sterling." The manager approached them directly, his expression tight with the particular strain of a man delivering news he already knew would go badly. "I'm terribly sorry. Due to storm damage on the east wing, we've had to consolidate several reservations. I'm afraid there's only one room currently available for your party." Victoria's expression didn't change right away. "One room. That's fine, we'll take separate—" "One room," the manager repeated carefully, glancing between the two of them with the wary look of a man about to make things worse. "And I should mention it only has the one bed." For a moment, neither Damian nor Victoria said anything at all. Damian stood in the middle of that lobby with rainwater still dripping off strangers' coats. And for a moment the whole weekend of careful performance threatened to collapse over a mattress. "There has to be something else," he said to the manager. "A cot, a couch in a conference room. I'll sleep in my car if I have to." "The lot's flooding on the east side, sir," the manager said, apologetic and exhausted at once. "And every rollaway we own is already in a hallway somewhere. I truly am sorry. We can offer a full refund of the night complimentary breakfast, anything you—" "We'll take the room," Victoria said. Damian turned to look at her. "Victoria, we'll take the room," she repeated, and there was something in her voice that ended the discussion right there in front of the desk, because 30 feet away, leaning against a marble pillar with a drink in his hand, Richard Cole was watching them with the patient interest of a man waiting for a magic trick to go wrong. Damian saw him too. He understood in half a second what Victoria had already worked out. An engaged couple arguing about sleeping arrangements in a hotel lobby was a story that would reach Eleanor Sterling before either of them reached the elevator. "Of course," Damian said loud enough to carry. "As long as you don't steal the blankets again." Victoria's mouth twitched. "I have never once stolen a blanket in my life." "She's a blanket criminal," Damian told the manager gravely. "You should have that on file." The manager, visibly relieved that no one was going to yell at him, produced a key card, like it was a peace treaty, and the two of them walked to the elevator, with Richard's eyes following them the entire way. The doors closed. The performance dropped off both their faces at the same instant. "Okay," Victoria said, staring at the climbing floor numbers. "Okay, this is fine. This is a logistics problem. You solve logistics problems for a living." "I move freight, Victoria. I don't usually have to share a bed with it." "Did you just compare me to freight?" "I compared the problem to freight. You're the client." "That's worse. Somehow, that's worse." But she was almost laughing, the nervous kind of laugh that's really just fear looking for an exit. And when the doors opened on the 4th floor, neither of them moved for a second, like stepping out would make the whole thing officially real. The room was nice. Of course it was nice. Everything about this weekend was nice in the specific way that made Damian feel like he was borrowing someone else's life. But all either of them could look at was the bed, one bed wide and white, and sitting in the middle of the room like an accusation. Victoria set her bag down and crossed her arms. "Rules." "Rules?" Damian agreed. "Pillow barrier down the middle, full length, non-negotiable." "Accepted. I'll take the side by the door." "Why the side by the door?" "Because if somebody comes through it at 3 in the morning, they come through me first." He said it plainly, without thinking the way he said most true things, and Victoria stopped mid-motion with a pillow in her hands. "That's nobody's coming through the door, right? This is a resort, not a war zone." "Habit," Damian said. "I've slept between my daughter's room and the front door for 6 years. You don't turn that off because the sheets got nicer." Victoria looked at him a moment longer than the comment required, then went back to building the barrier with the focused intensity of an engineer constructing a levee. "Rule 2. No touching. Obviously." "Obviously." "Rule 3. She hesitated. No talking after lights out. Talking in the dark makes people say things they don't mean. Or things they do mean," Damian said, "and that's the part that scares you." The pillow in her hands went still. "Rule 3 stands," she said, quieter now. "Rule 3 stands," he agreed, and went to change in the bathroom, and told himself the whole time that the strange tilting feeling in his chest was just exhaustion. The storm didn't care about their rules. It threw itself against the windows all night like it had a personal grievance, and somewhere past midnight, A crack of thunder hit close enough to rattle the glass, and the bedside lamps flickered twice and died, taking the hum of the air conditioning with them, and leaving the room in a darkness so complete that the pillow wall might as well not have existed. "Damian!" Victoria's voice came out of the dark, careful, controlled. "Are you awake?" "Rule 3, he said. "I'm invoking an emergency exception to Rule 3. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I hate this." The control in her voice slipped just enough for him to hear what was underneath it. "I hate the dark. I have since I was 9. It's stupid, I know it's stupid. I run a company with 40,000 employees, and I can't sit in a dark room without my chest doing this thing. Hey." He turned toward her voice, and even in pitch black he could feel her wound tight on the other side of the pillows. "It's not stupid. What happened when you were 9? For a long moment there was nothing but rain. "My father died when I was 9, Victoria said finally. "Heart attack in his study in the middle of the night. The power was out that night, too big storm, half the city dark. I was the one who found him because I got scared of the thunder and went looking for him instead of my mother because he was the one who was patient about things like that. And after that the dark just... it never went back to being empty. Every dark room has him in it somewhere." Damian lay still, letting the weight of it settle before he answered. He'd learned that from the grief counselor Ruth had made him see after Michelle, that the worst thing you could do with somebody's pain was hurry it along. "I'm sorry," he said. 9 is too young for that. Any age is too young, but 9. He exhaled. "My daughter was 1 when her mother died. Sometimes I catch myself being grateful she doesn't remember it, and then I hate myself for being grateful, because it also means she doesn't remember her. There's no version of it that doesn't cost you something. How did she die, your wife? If that's aneurysm. She was folding laundry." He heard Victoria's small intake of breath and kept going because he'd learned this too, that saying it plainly was the only way he could say it at all. That's the part nobody warns you about. You spend your whole life bracing for disasters that announce themselves, and then one Tuesday afternoon, the whole world just ends between one towel and the next. I was at work. Her mother called me. I don't remember driving to the hospital. I remember the parking lot, and then I remember a doctor's shoes, and then I remember about 6 months later, everything in between is just gone. "Damian." Her voice was very quiet. "You didn't have to tell me that. You told me about your father. That's different. I told you because I was scared of the dark, and I needed to hear another voice. And I told you because you're not the only one in this bed who knows what it costs to keep functioning after the floor disappears." He shifted, staring up at a ceiling he couldn't see. "You want to know the truth? I clocked it the first week I worked for you. The way you never take a real vacation. The way you answer emails at 2 in the morning. The way you flinch, just barely. Most people would miss it every time somebody at that company tells you how lucky you are. I know that routine, Victoria. I ran it for 3 years after Michelle. Work until you can't feel anything because feeling nothing beats feeling that." The rain filled the silence for a while. "Everyone thinks I don't celebrate my birthday because I'm too busy," Victoria said at last. "That's the story. Victoria Sterling, too important for cake. You want to know the real reason. The last birthday party I had, I was 24, and 11 people came, and within 2 years, every single one of them had either asked me for money, asked me for a job, or sold a story about me. 11 for 11. After that, I stopped wanting to know why people showed up." A humorless breath of a laugh. "It's easier to assume everyone wants something. You're never disappointed that way. You're never anything that way. That's not living, though. That's just a longer way of hiding. Says the man who hasn't been on a date in 6 years. That's different." "Is it?" Her voice turned gently and aimed itself right at him. "You hide behind your daughter the same way I hide behind my company. Don't think I haven't noticed. Ava needs me. The company needs me. Same sentence, different fonts. We're both using something we love as a bunker." Damian opened his mouth to argue and found to his considerable irritation that he couldn't. "Ruth said almost exactly that to me last Christmas," he admitted. "I didn't speak to her for 2 days. Because she was wrong. Because she was right, and I wasn't ready to hear it from somebody who loved me." He paused. Apparently I'm ready to hear it from a blanket criminal in the dark. Victoria laughed, a real one this time, startled out of her, and it broke something loose in the room. Some last layer of the performance. Neither of them had realized they were still wearing even here, even now. "Can I tell you the thing I actually can't say to anyone?" she said when the laugh faded. "The thing I can't even say to Julian." "Yeah, I'm tired, Damian." Her voice didn't crack. It did something worse. It went flat and small, the voice of someone stating inventory. "I'm tired of people wanting my money. I'm tired of pretending I don't need anyone. I'm tired of every conversation being a negotiation. I'm tired of being a machine that everyone admires and no one checks on. Do you know that in the last 5 years, not one person has asked me how I'm doing and waited for the real answer? Not one. They ask about the company. The company is doing wonderfully. The company doesn't cry in parking garages." Damian reached over the pillow barrier and found her hand in the dark. It broke Rule 2, and neither of them said so. Her fingers were cold, and they closed around his instantly hard, the grip of someone who'd been treading water longer than anyone knew. "How are you doing, Victoria?" he asked. Real answer. The silence went on so long he thought she might not manage it. "Badly," she whispered. "I'm doing badly. I have everything, and I'm doing badly, and I'm so ashamed of that I could disappear." "Don't be. Money can't fix lonely. Anybody who tells you otherwise has never had enough of either." He tightened his grip on her hand. "And listen to me, because I'm only going to say this once, and you're going to want to argue. You don't have to earn being cared about. It's not a bonus you hit targets for. It's not a deliverable. Whoever taught you that, it was your board, your mother, those 11 people. I don't care. They were wrong. And the proof is that I'm lying here at 1 in the morning holding your hand for free." He heard her breath catch. He heard her try to turn it into something composed and fail. Victoria Sterling, the woman who had stared down hostile boardrooms and activist investors and every tabloid in the country, cried in the dark next to a man she'd hired to lie for her, and he didn't try to stop it. And he didn't let go of her hand, and neither of them said another word about Rule 2 or Rule 3 for the rest of the night. Damian woke at 6:10 out of pure paternal habit, and it took him 3 full seconds to understand the situation he'd woken into. The pillow barrier had been breached. Not by him. His side of the line was intact, his body right where he'd left it. Victoria had crossed the border sometime in the night, sound asleep, her forehead against his shoulder, and her hand still knotted into his like she'd never let go of it. The power had come back. The clock blinked, and she looked for the first time since he'd met her completely unguarded. No boardroom, no armor, just a person sleeping the sleep of somebody who finally set something heavy down. He should wake her. He knew he should wake her. Instead, he lay there for 1 minute, exactly one, and let himself notice how long it had been since anyone had slept against him like he was somewhere safe to be. Then his phone buzzed on the nightstand, and Victoria came awake like a fire alarm, sat bolt upright, took in the geography of the bed, and went completely rigid. "That's my side," she said. "It is. I'm on your side." "You are. You could have moved me. You had a grip on my hand like a bear trap. I didn't want to lose the arm." He picked up the phone. "It's Ruth. Ava calls before school. When there's a storm, she gets nervous. Do you mind?" "No. God. Of course, take it." Victoria retreated to her side of the barrier and pretended badly not to listen. "Hey, sweet pea," Damian said into the phone, and his whole voice changed. Victoria heard it happen the way everything hard in him just unlocked. "You okay?" "I heard it got loud down there last night." "No, I'm safe, I promise. Big sturdy building, way sturdier than our house. You counted the seconds between the flash and the boom like I taught you, good girl. That means it's moving away. Yes, I'll be home tomorrow night. Yes, before bedtime. Have I ever missed bedtime? That was one time, and it was a flat tire, and you got pancakes for dinner out of it, so I don't want to hear it." A pause, and then a laugh that came all the way up from somewhere Victoria hadn't known he had. Okay, I love you more. No, I love you more, that's final. I'm the dad, I make the rules. Put Grandma Ruth back on." When he hung up, Victoria was staring at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She looked away. You become a completely different person on the phone with her." "No," Damian said. "That's the same person. This—" He gestured at the suit hanging on the closet door, the resort, the whole gilded weekend. "This is the different person." Victoria didn't answer that, but something moved across her face like weather, and she was quiet the whole time she got ready, and when they walked down to breakfast, she took his hand before they reached the dining room doors, before anyone could see them when it counted for absolutely nothing. Damian noticed. He didn't say a word. Eleanor Sterling was already seated at the family table, and she watched the two of them cross the room with the attention of an auditor. "You look rested," she said to Victoria, in a tone that made it sound like an allegation. "Both of you. I heard the storm displaced half the east wing. I do hope your room was adequate." "It was fine, Mother." Eleanor's eyes moved to Damian. "Tell me, Mr. Brooks, what did my daughter eat for breakfast on your first date?" The table went carefully still. Julian, 2 seats down, froze with his coffee halfway to his mouth. It was a test, and everyone at that table knew it was a test, and Victoria's hand found Damian's knee under the tablecloth in what he assumed was either encouragement or apology. "Nothing," Damian said. Eleanor's eyebrow rose. "Nothing." She ordered an egg white omelet, cut it into pieces, moved the pieces around, and answered 4 emails under the table. She thought I didn't see the phone. She ate maybe 2 bites. I finally made the waiter bring her a stack of pancakes she didn't order, and she told me pancakes were, and I quote, "an inefficient food." And then she ate the entire stack. He picked up his own coffee. She does the same thing at lunch meetings, by the way. Somebody should tell her assistant to just build pancakes into the calendar. Julian made a sound into his coffee that was definitely a laugh being strangled at birth. Eleanor stared at Damian for a long, unreadable moment. Because the answer wasn't rehearsed, no one could have rehearsed it. Priya's briefing binder covered anniversaries and hometowns. Not the way Victoria Sterling dismantled an omelet when her mind was somewhere else. The answer was the kind of thing you only knew about a person from watching her closely for years, with something more than professional attention, which Damian realized as he said it was exactly what he'd been doing. The fake story and the true one had the same evidence. "Pancakes," Eleanor said finally, and turned to her daughter. "You never eat pancakes." "I eat pancakes with him," Victoria said. And the strange thing, the thing that unsettled Damian more than any test Eleanor could have devised, was that it wasn't a lie. There had been a morning 8 months ago, a logistics crisis, a 6 a.m. working breakfast in a diner near the distribution hub because everything else was closed. He'd forgotten it. She hadn't. Eleanor looked between the two of them one more time, and something in her posture conceded a millimeter of ground. "Well," she said, and picked up her fork, and that single word was the closest thing to a blessing anyone had ever extracted from her. It should have been a good morning after that. For almost an hour it was. Then, Damian excused himself to take a call from his warehouse supervisor. A real call. Actual work, the ordinary machinery of his ordinary life reaching him even here. And when he stepped out into the corridor, off the dining room to finish it, Richard Cole was waiting for him alone with the relaxed posture of a man who had chosen his ground in advance. "Damian? Good. I was hoping to catch you without your handler." "She's my fiancé." "Sure she is." Richard smiled, and it was the smile of a man laying cards down one at a time for the pleasure of it. "Walk with me. 2 minutes. You'll want to hear this privately. Trust me, it's for your benefit." "Nothing about you is for my benefit. See, that's what I like about you. Direct. Victoria always did have a weakness for the salt of the earth thing." Richard slid his hands into his pockets. "Here's my problem, Damian. I've known Victoria Sterling since we were 25. I know how she moves, I know how she thinks, and I know that woman does not fall in love in the gap between 2 quarterly reports with a man from her own operations department that she's never once mentioned to a single living soul. So when she produces a fiancé 3 weeks before a gala where the board is demanding stability, I don't think, how romantic. I think, how efficient, because that's what she is, efficient. Is there a question coming? Damian said. Or is this just a man talking to hear himself? The question's coming. Richard stopped walking. They were alone in the corridor, rain still streaking the tall windows, and his voice dropped into something quieter and uglier. I made some calls yesterday. You'd be amazed what people tell you when your family sits on their board. I know your salary, Damian. I know your mortgage. I know you've got a kid in a public school in Bridgeport and a college fund with about enough in it for one semester of textbooks. And I know that 11 days ago, a trust with sterling family fingerprints all over it opened an education account in your daughter's name. Damian went very still. Everything in him went still the way it did in a crisis. The way it had in that hospital parking lot. The world narrowing to what mattered and what needed to happen next. You looked into my daughter, he said quietly. I looked into you. Your daughter's just a line item that turned up. Richard shrugged, and that shrug, the sheer weightlessness of it, a 6-year-old girl as a line item, did something to the temperature of Damian's blood. Relax. I don't care about the kid. I care about the con. And here's the offer, because I'm actually being generous. You develop a family emergency tonight. You go home before the gala. Whatever Victoria's paying you, I'll double it. Call it a finder's fee for showing me exactly how desperate she's gotten. She gets embarrassed, the board gets nervous, and people who understand this world step in to run things properly. Everyone lands on their feet, even you, especially you. And if I stay, then tomorrow night in front of 300 people, I ask some very specific questions about very specific wire transfers, and instead of a fairy tale, Victoria's gala becomes the story of a CEO so unstable she rented a fiancé. And you... Richard's smile came back thin as a paper cut. You become the man who took money to lie in public with your name attached. Think that stays off the internet. Think your daughter's school doesn't hear about it. Salt of the earth washes off fast, Damian. The corridor was silent except for the rain. And Damian did the math the way he did all math. Fast, cold, all variables on the table. The money, the threat, Ava. The wire transfer Richard could apparently see. The 300 people. Victoria's face in the dark last night saying badly, I'm doing badly, holding his hand like a rope. You made one mistake, Damian said. Richard tilted his head. Enlighten me. You assumed that because I needed the money is what I'm protecting. He stepped in one step close enough that Richard's easy posture stiffened close enough that there was no audience and no performance, and nothing in the space between them but the plain truth. You put my daughter's name in your mouth to move me. Men like you always go to the kid because you think a man with nothing to lose but his family is easy to steer. You've got it backwards. A man like me is the last man you threaten, Richard, because I've already lost the thing I couldn't survive losing and I'm still here. There is nothing you can take from me that I haven't already buried. Something flickered behind Richard's eyes, the first honest thing his face had done all weekend. So no! Damian went on level and quiet. I'm not taking your money. I'm not developing an emergency. I'm going to be at that gala tomorrow night standing next to her, and if you want to stand up in front of 300 people and tell them you spent your week digging through a widower's bank accounts because a woman got over you 2 years ago and you never got over it, you go right ahead. Read the room when you do it. See how it plays. He stepped back, straightened his jacket, and walked away down the corridor without waiting to be dismissed, because men like Richard Cole ran on being the one who ended conversations, and Damian had just taken that from him too. It wasn't until he turned the corner out of sight that his hands started shaking, because the speech had been true and the courage had been real, but so was the math, and the math was bad. Richard had the wire transfer. The wire transfer was real. There was a version of tomorrow night where every word Richard threatened came true, regardless of how it played, where Victoria's company took the hit, and Ava's name ended up in a comment section, and all of it traced back to the moment Damian Brooks said yes in a glass office because he wanted his little girl to have a future. He had to tell Victoria, tonight, before Richard chose his moment. She deserved to walk into that ballroom knowing exactly what was coming for her. And they'd face it together or not at all, but she would not be ambushed, not on his watch, not after last night. He found her on the terrace off the dining room alone at the railing, where they'd stood the evening before, and she turned when she heard him, and she was smiling. Actually smiling, open and easy, a morning's worth of walls still down, and for one terrible second, he almost couldn't do it. "There you are," she said. "My mother just told Julian, and I quote, that you were not entirely a disaster. Do you understand that's the nicest thing she's said about anyone since the Clinton administration? Damian, we might actually pull this off." Victoria. He took her hands, both of them, and watched the smile die by degrees as she read his face the way she read a bad quarterly report fast, and all the way to the bottom. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. It's about Richard. He knows." Her fingers went cold in his, exactly like the dark. "How much?" she said. "Everything," Damian said. "He knows everything, and he's going to burn it down tomorrow night." For a moment, Victoria didn't move at all. Her hands stayed in his, cold and motionless, and Damian watched her do the thing he'd seen her do in exactly one crisis meeting 3 years ago, when a warehouse fire had taken out a third of their Midwest inventory in a single night, watched her go somewhere behind her own eyes, somewhere fast and cold, and run the whole disaster forward to its end, before she allowed herself a single visible feeling about it. "Tell me exactly what he said," she said. "Word for word. Don't soften it." So Damian told her. The corridor, the calls Richard had made, the salary, the mortgage, the school in Bridgeport, the trust account with sterling fingerprints 11 days old, the offer to double her money, the threat about the wire transfers and the 300 people. He gave it to her the way she'd asked for it, plain and complete, and the only part he had trouble saying out loud was the part about Ava being a line item, because saying it made his jaw go tight all over again. When he finished, Victoria pulled her hands out of his, walked 3 steps down the terrace railing, and gripped it with both fists. "He went after your daughter. He went after me. Ava was just..." He put a 6-year-old's school in his mouth as leverage. Her voice had gone quiet in a way that was somehow louder than shouting. "I want you to understand something, Damian. I have spent 2 years being civilized about Richard Cole. 2 years of seating charts and shared board meetings and pretending the way things ended was mutual, because his family controls 9% of my company and civilized was cheaper. That arrangement ended about 90 seconds ago. Victoria. He digs through a widower's bank records. He finds a child, and his takeaway is that he's found a pressure point." She turned around and her eyes were bright and furious, and underneath the fury frightened, and Damian could see her hating the frightened part. "What did you tell him?" "I told him no." "Before or after he offered to double the money?" The question landed between them like a dropped glass, and the second it was out of her mouth, Damian watched her hear it, watched her realize what she'd just asked, and who she'd just asked it of. "That's not..." she started. "No. Go ahead." Damian kept his voice level, but something in it had gone hard. "Ask it all the way. You want to know if I thought about it. If the man you hired for money stayed loyal for money reasons or real ones. 11 for 11, right? Everybody sells eventually. That's the math you've been running your whole life, so run it on me." "Damian? I didn't mean..." "Yes, you did. For about 1 second you did, because that second is where you live. And I'm not even angry about it, Victoria. That's the part that kills me. I'm not angry because I understand exactly why that's the first place your mind goes." He crossed the space between them. "But you're going to hear my answer anyway. He offered me double. Then he threatened to put my daughter's name on the internet, and I turned him down flat in the space of one breath before I ever thought about the money, not because I'm a saint, but because last night a woman held my hand in the dark and told me the truth about her life for the first time in 15 years, and there is no number. Richard Cole can write that buys him the right to hurt her in public. So no, I didn't think about it. Run that through your math and tell me where it fits." Victoria stared at him. Her mouth opened once and closed again, and the fury on her face broke apart into something far more dangerous to both of them. "It doesn't fit," she said finally, barely above the wind. "You keep not fitting. 3 years of models that predict everybody and you keep breaking them." "Good," Damian said. "Somebody should." She laughed a wet, cracked laugh with no humor in it, and pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes for a second. And when her hand came down, the CEO was back. But she was different now. She wasn't wearing the CEO like armor anymore. She was wielding it like a tool. "Okay," she said. "Get Priya. Get Julian. My sweet 20 minutes. If Richard wants a war at my own gala, then we're going to spend tonight deciding what kind of war it is, because I'll be damned if he picks the battlefield and the weapon." 20 minutes later, the 4 of them were arranged around the sitting room of Victoria's suite. The suite she was supposed to have had the one the storm had given away, and Priya was pacing with a legal pad, while Julian sat very still with his elbows on his knees, which Damian had already learned was what Julian's version of alarm looked like. "Walk me through the exposure," Julian said. "Worst case, what does he actually have?" "He has the trust account," Priya said. "If his family's board access got him transaction visibility, which it shouldn't have, and believe me, I'm going to find out whose login he used, then he can show a payment structure that looks exactly like what it is. Money moving from a sterling vehicle into an account benefiting the daughter of the man Victoria announced as her fiancé 3 weeks later. Which proves nothing by itself," Julian said. "Wealthy people set up trusts for future stepchildren all the time. It's practically a courtship ritual in this family. It proves nothing in the courtroom. It proves everything in a ballroom." Priya stopped pacing. "He doesn't need a verdict, Julian. He needs a room full of investors to spend 30 seconds imagining the headline. CEO rents fiancé. That's it. That's the whole play. Doubt is the product, and he can manufacture it with 2 sentences and a raised eyebrow." "Then we get ahead of it," Julian said. "Statement tonight. Control the frame." "A statement saying what?" Victoria asked. "Pick the sentence, Julian. Give me the sentence that explains that account without lying and without confessing." The room went quiet because there wasn't one, and everyone in it was smart enough to know there wasn't one. "There's a third option," Priya said carefully in the tone of someone about to say a thing she'd already decided was necessary. "We give him what he actually wants. Which is, not the money. He doesn't need money. He wants you humiliated, or he wants back in, and between those two, one is negotiable." Priya looked at her boss steadily. "You take a private meeting tonight. You let him feel important. You dangle a board seat, a joint venture, something with his name on it, and this all quietly." "No," Damian said. Everyone looked at him. He hadn't planned to speak. The word had simply left him flat and final before the plan finished being described. "With respect, Priya, no. You're describing paying the ransom, and I've watched men like Richard my whole life at loading docks and union negotiations everywhere. There's a lever and somebody willing to pull it. You pay a man like that once you've taught him what you cost. He doesn't go away. He comes back every quarter forever, and every time he comes back, he owns a little more of her." Damian shook his head. "And there's a second problem. Even if it worked, Victoria, you'd spend the rest of your career knowing your company stands on a favor to the man who threatened a child to get it. You want to talk about tired? That's the kind of tired you don't come back from. Then what's your plan, Mr. Brooks?" Priya asked, not unkindly. "Because refuse on principle isn't a strategy, it's an epitaph. My plan is she tells the truth." The silence that followed had a texture to it. Julian actually turned his whole body to look at Damian, and Priya's pen stopped against the legal pad, and Victoria. Victoria just watched him, unreadable, waiting. "You've all been solving the wrong problem for 20 minutes, Damian said. "You're trying to figure out how to keep Richard from telling the room the engagement is fake. But Richard's weapon isn't the fact, it's the exposure. The secret is what gives him power. There's exactly one move on the board that takes the weapon out of his hand entirely, and it's the one nobody in this family has ever once considered, because you've all been trained since birth to treat the truth like a liability." He looked around the room. "She stands up tomorrow night before Richard says a word, and she tells them herself." "That's insane," Priya said. "Is it walk it through? What's the actual story?" "A board and a media cycle spent a year punishing a woman for being unmarried for that. Nothing else, her numbers are excellent. So she got backed into a corner and made a cold, practical decision to protect 40,000 jobs from a stupid narrative. That's not scandal. Half that room has done worse before breakfast. And here's the part Richard can't survive. The confession comes with a second half he doesn't see coming. Which is what? Julian asked. Damian looked at Victoria, and for a moment, the room and the strategy and the other two people in it fell away entirely. That somewhere in the middle of the lie, he said quietly, it stopped being one. Nobody spoke. Victoria's face did something complicated. Hope and terror trading places twice in the span of a breath, and Priya looked back and forth between the two of them like a woman watching a merger she hadn't been told about. Oh, Julian said softly. Oh, hell, it's real. Julian, Victoria warned. No, Vic, look at me. I need you to hear this as your brother and not as a shareholder. Julian leaned forward. If you stand up in that room and say what he's describing, it only works if it's true. The room will know. Mother will know in a quarter of a second, and Richard will know. And 300 people who read faces for a living will know. If it's a tactic, it's the worst tactic ever devised, and Richard will gut you with it. So before anybody builds a plan on it, somebody in this room has to say it out loud. He looked at his sister with more gentleness than Damian had thought the man contained. Is it true? Victoria stood up. She walked to the window. The rain had finally stopped, and the lake was black glass under a clearing sky, and she stood with her back to all of them for so long that Priya finally lowered her legal pad. I have a rule, Victoria said without turning around. No talking after lights out, because talking in the dark makes people say things. She turned around, and her eyes went straight to Damian and stayed there. Last night, I broke my own rule, and I told a man things I've never told my own family, and he held my hand until I fell asleep. And this morning I listened to him talk to his daughter on the phone, and I felt something I haven't felt since I was 9 years old, which is jealousy of a 6-year-old because somebody loved her that much, and it wasn't a transaction. Her voice cracked, and she let it in front of witnesses, which was itself an answer. So, yes, Julian, it's true. It's been true for longer than 3 weeks, if I'm honest, and I have been very carefully not being honest, because the last time I let something be true, 11 people taught me what it costs. Julian let out a long breath. Priya sat down slowly, wrote a single line on her legal pad, and Damian would learn later that the line said, "Cancel the exit statement." Okay, Julian said. Then we do it his way. The truth on our clock before Richard opens his mouth. He stood buttoning his jacket, already moving into logistics. Priya, I want to know who leaked the transaction data by noon, because that's a fireable offense with a lawsuit attached, and I want it in writing before the gala, so Richard walks in already bleeding. And someone has to handle Mother tonight. If Eleanor Sterling learns this from a ballroom stage, the Richard problem will be the second worst thing that happens tomorrow. I'll tell her, Victoria said. Vic? She's my mother, it's my lie, I'll tell her. Victoria squared her shoulders like a woman walking into surf. Where is she? Eleanor was, it turned out, 1 floor down, and she received her daughter and Damian at the door of her suite, with a look that said she'd been expecting a delegation of some kind since breakfast. Sit, she said. Both of you. Whatever this is, I'd rather hear it seated. Victoria sat. Damian stayed standing behind her chair, one hand on her shoulder. And if Eleanor noticed the geometry of that, and she noticed everything, she filed it away without comment. Mother, I have to tell you something about Damian and me, and I need you to let me finish before... You hired him, Eleanor said. Victoria stopped breathing for a second. What? 3 weeks before a gala. A man you'd never once mentioned. A trust account my accountants flagged 9 days ago because, unlike Richard Cole, I don't need to steal credentials to see my own family's money move. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. I'm 71 years old, Victoria. I've watched this family stage manage marriages, mergers, and 2 funerals. Did you honestly believe I couldn't recognize a production when it checked into the same hotel as me? You knew, Victoria said faintly. You knew at breakfast. The omelet question was a test, yes, which he passed. Eleanor's eyes moved to Damian. That was the peculiar thing, you see. The arrangement was obvious, but the answer wasn't rehearsed. No briefing document on earth includes the way my daughter dissects an egg white omelet when she's answering emails under a table. That is 3 years of paying attention, Mr. Brooks. One does not pay that kind of attention to a person for money. So I found myself watching a fake engagement conducted by 2 people telling the truth, and I decided to wait and see which one of you would notice first. Damian's hand tightened on Victoria's shoulder. Mrs. Sterling, whatever you think of how this started. How it started is the only unremarkable part, Eleanor said crisply. Do you know how my late husband and I met Mr. Brooks? Our fathers arranged it. A merger with a wedding attached 1979, and I cried for a week before the engagement party because I was in love with a music teacher my family had already chased off. And then I spent 30 years with a man who turned out to be the finest person I've ever known. And I held his hand in the dark the night the power went out and he died. And I have spent every night since wishing arrangements like ours came with warranties. Her voice never wavered, but something ancient moved behind it. So, I am the last woman alive who gets to sneer at a love that started as a contract. The start is nothing. The start is paperwork. What matters is what you do when the paperwork catches fire, which I gather from the looks on both your faces is why you're here. So Victoria told her about Richard. All of it. The corridor, the threats Ava, the plan for tomorrow night. Eleanor listened without interrupting once, and when it was done she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the last thing either of them expected. Good. Good, Victoria repeated. The truth publicly on your terms. It's the first strategy anyone in this family has proposed in 40 years that your father would have liked. Eleanor rose, walked to her daughter, and did something Damian suspected was rarer than any confession made in that room. She took Victoria's face in both hands. I pushed you toward this gala announcement. I told myself it was for the company. It was fear, Victoria, an old woman's fear, that you'd end up alone in a beautiful office, and I handled it the only way this family has ever handled fear, which is by scheduling it. I'm sorry. Tomorrow night when you stand up, you look at Richard Cole, and you remember that you are my daughter and your father's daughter, and this family has survived far worse than an embarrassed man with a microphone. Then she looked over Victoria's head at Damian. And you. If she falters up there, you do not let her stand alone. Am I understood? You were understood before you said it, Damian answered, and Eleanor Sterling smiled at him for the first time, a small, fierce, sudden thing gone almost before it landed. The gala was everything. The whole exhausting machine of the weekend had been built for 300 people. Half the company's board, a lineup of speeches and awards, and a program Priya had spent months constructing, and now folded invisibly into it, a battlefield with the ground chosen and the hour set. Victoria was scheduled to speak at 9. Damian spent the first 2 hours doing the work of a fiancé. Handshakes, small talk. Victoria's hand in his, and doing the other work too. The operations manager work, tracking Richard Cole across the ballroom, the way he'd track a shipment he knew was going to go wrong. Richard was patient. Richard worked the room like a man distributing kindling, a murmured word to a board member here, a raised eyebrow to a journalist there, and at 8:40 he caught Damian's eye across the crowd and lifted his glass half an inch, and the message in it was unmistakable. Last chance. Damian lifted his own glass back, held Richard's gaze, and slowly, deliberately shook his head. At 8:55, Priya appeared at Richard's elbow with an envelope and a smile, and Damian watched from 30 feet away as Richard opened it, read it, and lost approximately half the color in his face. The letter Damian knew contained 3 things: the identity of the compliance officer whose credentials Richard had borrowed, that officer's signed statement from noon, and a single sentence from Sterling Technologies' general counsel about the criminal statutes governing unauthorized access to financial records. Julian had wanted it delivered at 9:05 after Richard was already committed. Damian had argued for 8:55 before and had won the argument with one sentence. I don't want him ambushed into it. I want him choosing it knowing the price, Because if we only win when he's surprised, we haven't actually won. At 9 o'clock, the program host called Victoria Sterling to the stage, and the room applauded. And Richard Cole, bleeding cornered, and too proud to feel it, yet set down his glass, and moved toward the front. And Damian saw the decision settle onto him like a coat. He was going to do it anyway. Some men would rather burn in public than walk away in private, and Richard had just revealed which kind he was. Victoria reached the podium. She looked out at the room, and Damian, standing near the exit where they'd planned it close enough to reach her, far enough to see everything, watched her find him in the crowd, hold his eyes for one long second, and take a breath. And then Richard's voice cut across the ballroom before she'd said a word. "Victoria." Before the speeches start. He was moving up the center aisle, glass-abandoned smile fixed, and 300 faces swung toward him like weather vanes. "I think the room deserves the real headline of the evening, don't you? Why don't you tell everyone how long you've actually known your fiancé? Or better, tell them what your family's trust paid into his daughter's account 11 days before you announced him. Tell them what an engagement costs these days, Victoria. Give the investors a number." The sound the room made was the sound Damian had heard once at a racetrack the moment before a crash. A single collective intake of breath, 300 people realizing at once that the evening had left the program. Somewhere to the left, a journalist's phone was already up and recording. Eleanor Sterling, seated in the front row, did not move a muscle. Julian took one step toward the aisle and stopped, because his sister had raised one hand from the podium, not at Richard, at her own people, a general holding her line. "Thank you, Richard," Victoria said, and her voice came through the speakers, steady as bedrock. "You're right. The room deserves the real headline. I was going to make you all sit through 6 minutes of quarterly gratitude first, but Richard's never been able to wait for anything, which incidentally is a matter of record, with at least 2 women in this room." A shock of laughter cracked the tension, brief, involuntary. And Damian watched Richard's jaw tighten. Watched him realize half a second too late that she wasn't flinching, that she was walking toward the fire instead of away from it. "So here's the truth," Victoria said. "All of it from me, because I'll be damned if you hear it as an accusation when you can hear it as a fact. 3 weeks ago, I offered a man in my operations division a business arrangement. I asked him to pretend to be my fiancé for 1 weekend, and I offered to fund his daughter's education in exchange, and he accepted. That is exactly what Richard is describing, and every word of it is true." The silence was total. Even the waitstaff had stopped. Richard stood in the center aisle with his triumph evaporating in his hands, because a weapon that's been handed over willingly stops being a weapon, and he could feel it going and couldn't name why. "And now the part Richard doesn't know," Victoria said, "because you can't find it in a bank record. I want to tell you why I did it. I did it because for 18 months, this board, this industry, and half the people drinking my wine right now have treated an unmarried 32-year-old CEO as a risk factor. Not my numbers. My numbers are the best in this company's history, and every person in this room knows it. My life. My private personal life was traded like a commodity until I got tired enough to buy it back with a lie. That's on me. I chose the lie, and I'm standing here telling you I chose it, and if the board wants to weigh that tomorrow, weigh it." She paused, and her hands, which had been gripping the podium, let it go. "But before you vote on anything, you're going to know the whole truth, which is that the lie failed. It failed completely. Because somewhere between the contract and tonight, I got to watch that man wake up before sunrise to call his daughter about a thunderstorm. I watched him turn down double the money to protect me when I wasn't in the room and would never have known. I told him things in the dark that I have never told a living soul, and he is the only person I have ever met, the only one in 32 years who treated me like I was worth something before he knew what I owned." She stepped out from behind the podium and grabbed the microphone right out of its stand and walked past 300 stunned investors to the front edge of the stage and pointed straight at the quiet man standing near the exit. "That man," she said, her voice finally shaking, "is the reason I'm still standing here. Not the company, not the name. Him. So, Richard, you came tonight to expose a fake engagement, and you were 3 days too late because there's nothing fake left in it on my side. Nothing. The microphone trembled in her hand, and she didn't care, and everyone could see she didn't care. There's only one person in this room who doesn't owe me an answer, and gets asked for one anyway. So I'm asking. In front of everyone, no contract, no exit clause, nothing in it for you but me, and God knows that's a worse deal than the first one. 300 people turned to look at Damian Brooks. And Damian, whose whole life had taught him to have a plan for everything, stood by that exit with his heart going like a freight line. Looked at Victoria Sterling, shaking on a stage she'd owned her entire adult life, and opened his mouth. Damian didn't remember deciding to move. One moment he was standing by the exit with 300 faces turned toward him like a jury, and the next his legs were carrying him up the center aisle, past the journalist with the phone, past Julian, past Richard Cole, standing frozen in the wreckage of his own ambush. And the room was so quiet, he could hear his own shoes on the parquet every step all the way to the front of that stage. Victoria stood at the edge of it, with the microphone still trembling in her hand, and up close, he could see what the room couldn't, that she had spent everything, that the speech had emptied the account, that she was standing up there, with no armor left at all, in front of the people most capable of hurting her because of him. "Give me that," Damian said quietly and held out his hand. She handed him the microphone. Their fingers touched around it, and hers were ice cold exactly like the dark, and he held them there a second longer than the handoff required, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch. Then Damian Brooks turned around and faced the wealthiest room he had ever stood in. "Most of you don't know me," he said. "That's fine. Up until 3 weeks ago, the only people in this company who knew my name were the ones whose freight showed up on time because of it. So, let me introduce myself properly. My name is Damian Brooks. I'm an operations manager. I make in a year what some of you spent on tonight's table. I drive a 9-year-old Honda. I pack a school lunch every morning at 6:15, and I have been a widower for 6 years, which means I know something most people in this room have been lucky enough not to learn yet, which is exactly how fast everything you love can be taken off the table without anybody asking your permission. Nobody moved. Even the phones had gone still. Victoria told you the truth, so I'll tell you mine. Yes, I took the deal. A man offered me my daughter's education for 1 weekend of pretending, and I took it and I'd take it again, and any parent in this room who says they wouldn't is lying to themselves in formal wear." A low ripple moved through the crowd. Not laughter exactly, something more like recognition. But here's what I didn't plan on. I didn't plan on finding out that the woman I was pretending for was realer than anybody I've met in 6 years. I didn't plan on watching her carry this whole company on her back while a room full of people who profit off her strength took turns calling her cold. And I sure didn't plan on standing on a stage in a rented tuxedo in front of 300 strangers, feeling like the luckiest man in the state of Illinois. He turned to Victoria, and the room disappeared for him, the way it had on the terrace, the way it had in the dark. "You asked me a question," he said. "And you deserve an answer tonight in front of all of them, because you were brave enough to ask it in front of all of them. So here it is." He took a breath. "The answer is yes. It's been yes since about 2 o'clock this morning, if I'm honest. So you're not asking me anything my heart hasn't already signed. But," and he held up one hand as her face broke open, "it's a yes with a condition, and the condition is non-negotiable. And you, of all people, will respect a non-negotiable term." "Name it," Victoria said, and her voice cracked clean in half on both words, and she didn't care, and the microphone caught it and carried it to every corner of the room. "There's a 6-year-old girl about 3 hours from here who has been my whole board of directors since the day her mother died," Damian said. "Nothing in my life happens without her vote. Not this. Especially not this. So my answer is yes, pending shareholder approval." He looked back out at the crowd. "She controls 51%. The room came apart. It started somewhere in the back. One person clapping, then 10. Then the sound rolled forward and crashed over the stage, 300 people on their feet, and Damian would spend the rest of his life claiming he saw a board member in his 70s wipe his eyes with a cocktail napkin, and no one would ever be able to prove otherwise. Victoria was laughing and crying at the same time, both hands over her mouth. And when Damian opened his arms, she stepped into them in front of everyone, and the cameras got it all. And for once in her entire public life, she didn't spare one single thought for how it would look. Richard Cole stood alone in the center aisle through all of it. Damian saw him over Victoria's shoulder, saw the exact moment Richard understood that he had not merely lost, but had personally constructed the stage for his own defeat, that every ounce of pressure he'd applied had been converted in real time into the most public love story that Ballroom had ever hosted. Richard's face went through fury and arithmetic and landed somewhere gray, and he turned to leave and found Eleanor Sterling standing directly in his path. She hadn't raised her voice all evening. She didn't raise it now. But the people nearest to them stopped applauding to listen, because Eleanor Sterling, in a quiet mood, was a spectacle of its own. "Richard." She said his name the way a judge reads a docket number. "Before you go, I want to thank you. Eleanor, you spent this week digging through the private finances of a widowed father, and you found a trust I set up for a little girl. And you walked into my family's evening and tried to detonate it in front of the press." Eleanor's voice never lifted, never hurried. "And in doing so, you accomplished what 18 months of my meddling could not. You forced my daughter to stand up in public and tell the truth about her life, and you gave that man an occasion to show this entire industry his character. You are without question the most useful failure this family has ever been threatened by. Your daughter defrauded her own investors with a staged..." "My daughter disclosed a personal arrangement voluntarily at a podium and received a standing ovation for it, which you are currently standing in the middle of." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Whereas you, dear boy, accessed confidential financial records using a compliance officer's stolen credentials, a signed statement to that effect has been in your pocket since 8:55, and copies have been with our general counsel since noon. So here is what happens now, and I will only say it once. You will walk out of this ballroom quietly. By Monday, your family will announce that you are stepping back from the board to pursue other interests, and your father will thank us privately for the opportunity to phrase it that way instead of the other way. And you will never again, not in a boardroom, not in a courtroom, not in a comment to a journalist, say the name of that child. Because if you do, Richard, I will stop being civilized about you, and I have been waiting 2 years for a reason." Richard Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her once at Victoria and Damian on the stage, and whatever he saw there closed the last door in him, and he walked out of the ballroom through the applause meant for someone else, and the doors swung shut behind him. And that was the last time either of them ever saw him in person. Julian appeared at Eleanor's side with 2 glasses of champagne and handed her one. "The most useful failure this family has ever been threatened by," he quoted. "Mother, I have never loved you more." "Drink your champagne, Julian." It was almost 1 in the morning before Damian and Victoria escaped the ballroom, the handshakes the board members suddenly eager to know him, the journalist who wanted a quote and got from Victoria only, "He said yes, pending shareholder approval, and you may print exactly that," and found themselves back on the same terrace where everything had cracked open the night before. The sky had finally cleared. Victoria had her heels in one hand again, and Damian's jacket over her shoulders, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, because some hours don't need narrating. "So," Victoria said eventually, "pending shareholder approval." "I meant that. Every word of it. I know you did. It's why the room fell apart." She turned to face him, and the giddiness was still in her, but underneath it something more careful had surfaced, something that had been waiting all night for the crowd to leave. "Damian, I need to say something before tomorrow, before the drive home, before any of the next part starts, and I need you to let me get all the way through it." "Okay." Tonight was the easy part. Damian raised an eyebrow. "You just confessed a fake engagement to your entire board with the press in the room. That was the easy part." "Yes, because tonight was my world, and my world I know how to fight in. Podiums, boards, Richard, I've trained for those my whole life. But tomorrow, the story leaves that ballroom, and it goes places I can't control, and it lands on a 6-year-old in Bridgeport who never asked to be in it." Her hands tightened on the railing. "I watched your face tonight when the phones came out. Everyone else saw a man being applauded. I saw a father counting cameras. So I need you to hear me say it plainly. I know what I'm asking you to walk into. My life comes with a searchlight attached, and it doesn't have an off switch, and the last thing on this earth I want is to be the reason that little girl's childhood gets smaller. If there's a version of this where you look at all that and say, it's too much, I'd rather hear it now on this terrace than watch it happen slowly over 2 years. Damian was quiet for a while. She let him be quiet. She'd learned that about him by now, that his silences were work being done, not distance. You want honesty? He said finally. Here's honesty. Yes, it scares me. Not you, the machine around you. I spent tonight in a room where the flower budget was more than my salary, and about every 20 minutes some voice in the back of my head asked me what I think I'm doing there. What happens the first time some website does the math on our 2 lives and turns me into a punchline? What happens when Ava's classmates' parents start treating her different? I don't have answers for any of that yet, and I'm not going to pretend I do. Damian, I said honesty, so let me finish because there's a second half. He turned and took her by the shoulders gently, the way he did when Ava needed to hear something all the way. 6 years ago, I learned the actual price of everything. Not the tabloid price, the real one. And ever since I've made every decision in my life by one measure, when I'm old sitting on some porch, which choice will I be able to live with? And Victoria, I already know I can live with the searchlight. I can live with the punchlines and the math and every rich stranger who ever looks sideways at my shoes. The thing I can't live with is being the man who found something like this twice in one lifetime. Twice when most people don't get it once and let it go because he was afraid of cameras. He shook his head slowly. That man doesn't get to sit on my porch. So no, I'm not walking away. But I do have terms, and I'm telling you them tonight so they never surprise you. Name them. Ava stays out of it, completely. No photos, no interviews, no cute stories fed to friendly reporters to soften your image no matter how well-meaning. Her name doesn't appear in a single press strategy ever. If protecting her ever costs your company a good headline, her side wins every time, no discussion. Agreed. Before you finished the sentence, agreed. Second, I keep my job. My actual job. I'm not going to become a decorative husband with a courtesy title, and I'm not taking a promotion. I didn't earn just so the org chart looks less awkward. If anything, put me under harder review than anyone else at my level, and put it in writing. Because the day people start saying I'm carried is the day I can't walk through my own warehouse. Victoria almost smiled. You realize most men in your position would be negotiating in the other direction. Most men in my position didn't spend 6 years teaching a little girl that you are what you do when nobody owes you applause. He held up a third finger. Last one. Whatever happens with Ava tomorrow, however her vote goes, you don't perform for her. Don't bring a gift the size of a refrigerator. Don't be the fun, exciting lady with the helicopter. Just be the person from the dark, the real one, the one who's scared of thunderstorms and eats pancakes when somebody makes her. Because that kid can smell a performance from across a state line, and the person from the dark is the one I'm... He stopped himself half a second too late, and Victoria's whole face changed. Say it, she said quietly. You were about to say it. On $0 with no contract, say it. The person from the dark, Damian said, is the one I'm in love with. And Victoria Sterling, who had negotiated against sovereign wealth funds without her pulse moving, made a sound like the wind had been taken out of her and kissed him. No cameras, no crowd, no one to convince the first one that had never been for anybody else. And it was a long time before either of them said anything again, and what Victoria finally said against his shoulder was, I'm terrified of tomorrow. Of a 6-year-old. Of a 6-year-old. Richard, no, your daughter completely. Good instincts, Damian said. She's the toughest room you'll ever play. The drive home the next day took 3 hours, and Victoria followed in her own car a day later by design, because Damian had been firm about the sequence, Ruth first, then Ava, and nobody meets anybody until the people who held his life together for 6 years had their say. Ruth was waiting on the porch when he pulled in Sunday night, and one look at his face told her most of it, and the internet, it turned out, had already told her the rest. You're on the news, she said by way of hello. My sister in Memphis sent me a video, says the caption calls you the fiancé who brought down a boardroom. You want to explain to me how a fake engagement I signed off on for tuition money ended in a standing ovation, or should I just keep learning about my family from Facebook? So he sat with her at the same kitchen table, where the whole thing had been decided, and he told her everything. The storm, the room, the dark, Richard, the corridor, Ava's name in that man's mouth, the letter, the stage, the terrace. Ruth listened, the way she always listened, with her hands around a coffee cup and her eyes doing quiet work, and when he finished, she was silent for a long moment. "I told you it was a terrible idea," she said. "You did. And I told you to do it anyway. You did that too. So the way I see it, this whole thing is technically my fault, and I'd like that noted at the wedding." But her eyes were wet when she said it, and she reached across the table and gripped his hand hard. "Damian, look at me. I have watched you be half a person for 6 years. A good father, the best I've ever seen, but half a person, and I promised my daughter's memory I'd never say so out loud, unless the day came when it mattered. It matters now, so hear me. Michelle would not have wanted a shrine. She would have wanted this, you terrified and alive and stupid in love, taking the risk. If that woman is who you say she is, then you bring her to this house and you let me feed her. And God help her, I'll ask her the questions you're too polite to. Ruth, I raised one daughter who loved you. I'm entitled to vet the second one." Then there was the harder conversation. The small one, the one Damian had been composing in his head for 300 miles. He sat on the edge of Ava's bed Monday night after homework and after bath time, and she looked up at him with Michelle's eyes, and knew instantly, the way she always knew, that this wasn't a regular tuck-in. "You have the face," she said. "What face?" "The important talk face. Am I in trouble?" "No, baby, nobody's in trouble. But I do need to talk to you about something big, and I need you to know that whatever you think about it, whatever you really think, not what you think, I want to hear that's the thing that counts. Deal. Deal. You know how I went away for work this weekend." He took a breath and found to his mild horror that he was more nervous than he had been on the stage. "While I was there, I spent a lot of time with someone, a friend, a woman, and Ava, Daddy likes her. A lot. The way I used to like Mommy." Ava was quiet, and her face did something careful and complicated, 6 years old going on 40, and Damian's heart hung in the silence like a coat on a hook. "Does she know about Mommy?" Ava asked finally. "She knows everything about Mommy that I could tell her, and she asked questions, good ones, and she listened to every answer." "Is she nice to waiters?" This was in Ava's cosmology the supreme test of character absorbed from years of her father's quiet example, and Damian had to bite down on the inside of his cheek. "I watched her all weekend," he said honestly. "She's learning. She's had a strange life, baby, a life where a lot of people were only nice to her because she has a lot of money. And that made her forget how to trust people for a while. But underneath all that, she's kind, and she's brave, and she's a little bit scared of the dark, just like somebody else I know. I'm not scared of the dark. I'm scared of thunder. It's different." "My mistake." Ava picked at the edge of her blanket, working up to the real question. And when it came in the small voice she saved for the things that lived at the very bottom. "If you like her the way you liked Mommy," she said, "do you have to stop liking Mommy?" And Damian gathered his daughter up into his lap blanket, and all the way he had when she was 2, and held her against his chest where she could hear his heart. "Never," he said into her hair. "Not ever. Listen to me, because this is the truest thing I know. Love isn't like your juice cup, where when it's gone, it's gone. Love is like a fire, baby. When you use one fire to light another one, the first fire doesn't get smaller. There's just more light in the house. Mommy has her fire in here." He put her small hand flat against his chest. "And it will be burning there when I'm 100 years old, and nothing and nobody moves it. Not ever. This would just be more light. That's all. More light in the house." Ava was quiet for a long time against his chest, long enough that he thought she might have drifted. And then she said very seriously, "What's her name?" "Victoria." "That's a queen name." "It is, kind of." Does she want to meet me? She's so nervous about meeting you, Damian said, that she asked me twice what your favorite color is and then wrote it down. Ava sat up at that, deeply gratified, and rendered her verdict with the crisp finality of a chairman closing a meeting. She can come for pancakes Saturday. If she's nice to Grandma Ruth and she doesn't do fake voice. Here, Ava demonstrated the high syrupy tone certain adults used on children with devastating accuracy. Then I'll decide. That's fair. That's more due process than most people get. What's due process? Something you're going to be very good at. Go to sleep. Victoria arrived Saturday morning at 9, and Damian knew the moment he opened the door that she had heard him on the terrace and had taken it fully to heart because the woman standing on his porch had no driver in sight, no assistant, no refrigerator-sized gift. She was in jeans and a sweater, holding one modest paper bag, and she looked more frightened than she had looked facing down 300 investors and a hostile press row. "Hi," she said. "Before you say anything, I need you to know I've been sitting in my car at the end of your street for 25 minutes. I have rewritten my opening line 11 times, and Priya offered to write me a briefing document on 6-year-olds, and I said no, and I'm regretting it." "What's in the bag?" "Blueberries. You said pancakes. I panicked in a grocery store, Damian. Me. There's video somewhere of me addressing the World Economic Forum, and this morning I stood in a produce aisle for 10 minutes because I couldn't decide if bringing fruit was trying too hard." "It's perfect. Come meet the shareholder." Ava was waiting in the kitchen on the stool she'd selected for its authority, with Ruth stationed at the stove, like an honor guard, and the little girl looked the billionaire CEO up and down, with an unhurried forensic attention that Victoria would later swear was more thorough than her last SEC audit. "You're Victoria," Ava said. "I am. You're Ava. Your dad talks about you constantly, like constantly. I know about the dolphin argument." Ava's eyes narrowed with interest. "Dolphins are mammals." "They are. Marcus was wrong. He was so wrong." And just like that, a bridge was flung across the gap because Victoria Sterling had done the one thing no adult in Ava's experience ever did, which was arrive already briefed and take her side on the record. Ava slid off the stool, walked over and delivered her opening interrogatory. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" "No," Victoria said. "I'm going to be honest with you because your dad says you can tell when people aren't. I don't know how to make pancakes. Nobody ever taught me. I didn't grow up in a house where people cooked together." "That's sad." "It was a little bit, yeah." Ava considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing mitigating circumstances. Then she took Victoria's hand, and Damian, watching from the doorway, felt the floor of his chest drop, the way it had when the storm knocked the power out, and pulled her toward the stove. "I'll teach you," Ava said. "I'm very good at it. Grandma Ruth taught me, and my mommy taught her. You have to learn the flip. The flip is the whole thing. Everybody thinks it's the batter, but it's the flip." And Victoria Sterling, 32 years old, who owned buildings on 3 continents, stood at a stove in Bridgeport with flour on her sweater, and let a 6-year-old adjust her grip on a spatula, and ruined the first pancake completely, and the second one worse. And on the third one, Ava physically guided her wrist through the motion, and the pancake went up and came down whole, and the child cheered, and Victoria laughed in a way Damian had never heard from her. Undefended, unmanaged all the way down, and Ruth caught Damian's eye across the kitchen, and gave him one slow nod, and that nod contained an entire verdict. The morning became an afternoon. The afternoon became a project involving Ava's diorama of the ocean, wherein Victoria was assigned the cutting out of 17 paper fish, and performed the task with the focus of a woman closing a merger. At some point, Ava disappeared upstairs and returned with a photograph and put it directly into Victoria's hands, and the whole kitchen went still. "That's my mommy," Ava said. "Daddy says I have her eyes, but I have to take his word for it because I don't remember. Do you think I have her eyes?" Victoria looked at the photograph for a long moment. Damian watched her from the counter and did not breathe, because there were 100 wrong answers, and most adults would have grabbed the nearest one in a panic, and Victoria took her time the way she'd taken her time in the dark. "Yes," she said finally. "You have her eyes exactly. And Ava, I want to tell you something and it's important, so I'm going to say it the true way, not the grown-up way. I'm not here to be your mommy. Nobody ever gets to be that except her, and anybody who tried would be silly because look at her, she's clearly irreplaceable. I'm just hoping if you decide it's okay that I could be something else. Something we'd figure out together. There's no word for it yet. We'd have to invent it. Ava studied her for a long moment with those forensic eyes. Like more light in the house, she said. Victoria blinked. What? It's a thing my dad says. Ava took the photo back, set it carefully on the counter facing the room so her mother could see the proceedings, and turned back around. Okay, I decided. The kitchen went silent. Ruth stopped drying the dish in her hands. Damian straightened up off the counter, and Victoria set down her paper fish and faced the shareholder meeting like she was standing at that podium all over again. And it occurred to Damian watching her that she was more afraid of this verdict than she had been of the entire ballroom, and that this fact more than anything that had happened on any stage was how he knew. You can stay, Ava announced. You did the flip on your third try, and you didn't do the fake voice even once, and you said the true thing about my mommy instead of the weird thing grown-ups say. So my vote is yes. Then she held up one finger, her father's daughter, to the marrow. Pending. Pending, Victoria repeated carefully. Pending what? Pending you come back next Saturday, and the one after that. Pancakes isn't a one-time thing, Victoria. It's a whole thing you have to keep doing. And Victoria Sterling, who had in the span of 8 days been blackmailed, ambushed, applauded, engaged, and vetted, put her hand over her mouth and nodded, because she could not at that particular moment produce a single word. And Ava took this as full ratification and went back to her diorama, and Ruth turned back to the sink, and if she was crying into the dishwater, she did it with her back straight, the way her generation had learned to. That night, after Ava was asleep and Ruth had gone home, and the two of them stood in the quiet of his small kitchen, amid the wreckage of flour and paper fish, Victoria leaned against the counter and looked around Damian's house. The crayon drawings on the refrigerator, the school calendar, the couch that had been sat into the shape of 6 years, and said, I have negotiated deals worth more than the GDP of small countries, and nothing I have ever won felt like, you can stay. She likes you. She doesn't like everyone. Her preschool assessment used the word discerning, which we're pretty sure was diplomatic. Damian. Victoria's voice had shifted into something quieter, and he turned from the sink to look at her. Today, in your kitchen with flour on my hands, was the best day of my life. I need you to understand, I'm not saying that romantically. I'm saying it statistically. I ran the comparison. Every deal, every launch, every magazine cover I put today, up against all of it, and it isn't close. And that terrifies me more than Richard ever did, because now I know exactly what I have to lose, and I've spent my whole life making sure I never knew that feeling. Welcome to it, Damian said gently. That feeling has a name. It's called having a family. The fear doesn't go away, I won't lie to you. You just learn to carry it, because the alternative is not having the thing. And once you've had the thing, he shrugged, there's no going back to the office. They stood there in the kitchen, and everything was for the length of an evening completely whole, which was exactly when Damian's phone lit up on the counter. Priya's name at 9:40 on a Saturday night, and Victoria saw it and frowned. Because Priya did not call on Saturday nights. Priya guarded weekends like a boarder, and Damian answered and listened, and Victoria watched every degree of warmth leave his face in the span of 10 seconds, watched the father surface through the man like something rising through water. Send it to me, he said in a voice she'd never heard him use. Right now. The phone buzzed. He opened the message. And there on the screen of a gossip site that had gone up within the hour under a headline about the billionaire's fairy tale was a photograph long lens taken that very afternoon through his own kitchen window of Victoria Sterling at a stove and a little girl in pigtails guiding her hand through the flip. Ava's face unblurred. Ava's street identifiable. Ava's name in the caption spelled correctly. Damian set the phone face down on the counter with a control that was more frightening than any shout, and looked up at Victoria and the distance between the terrace and this kitchen collapsed to nothing at all. "You told me the searchlight doesn't have an off switch," he said quietly. "So tell me now, and tell me the truth, because everything depends on the answer. Can you protect her, or can't you?" Victoria didn't answer him with words. Not at first. She picked up her own phone off the counter, dialed and put it to her ear, and when it connected, her voice came out in a register Damian had heard exactly once before in the dark when she'd said badly. "I'm doing badly," except this time the rawness in it had been forged into something with an edge. "Priya, it's me, I've seen it. Wake up legal. No, all of legal. I want the outside firm too. I want Marcus's cell ringing in the next 90 seconds. The photograph was taken through the window of a private residence with a telephoto lens of a minor child in the state of Illinois, and I want the site served before midnight. Injunction takedown damages all of it, and I want the photographer's name by morning because whoever it is followed me here, which means they were on my details radar and somebody missed it, and we are going to have a separate conversation about that." A pause. "And Priya, call the wire services personally. Tonight. Tell them the family is invoking the children's privacy standards every legitimate outlet signed on to years ago, and any publication that runs the child's face or name will find that Sterling Technologies has a very long memory and a very large advertising budget. Word for word. Yes. Go." She hung up, and only then did she turn back to Damian, and only then did he see that her hands were shaking. Not with fear this time, but with a fury she was holding by the collar. "That's the machine," she said. "The machine is already moving, and the machine is good, and by tomorrow, that photo will be down, and that site will be choosing between a settlement and a very bad year. But you didn't ask me about the machine, Damian. You asked me if I can protect her, and I owe you the honest answer. So here it is." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him. "No, not completely. Nobody can. Not me, not you, not 100 lawyers. As long as I am in your lives, there will be lenses, and some nights one of them will get through, and I can fight every single one after the fact. But I cannot promise you a world where it never happens. That's the truth. And if I told you anything prettier, I'd be lying to you in your own kitchen, and I promised myself on that terrace I'd never do that." Damian looked at her for a long moment. The phone lay face down between them like something that had died on the counter. "Keep going," he said quietly. "There's more. I can see it. There's more." Victoria took a breath. "You can't stop every lens, but you can decide what the lens costs, and you can decide what it finds. And here's what I know that you don't yet, because you've only lived on one side of this. The photographers come hardest when there's a mystery. A hidden child is a bounty. A protected, boring, off-limits family is a bad day's pay. So we take the mystery off the table. Not her, never her, your terms, stand her face and her name, stay out of everything forever. But us. We stop giving them a hunt. We let them have the dull version, the CEO who drives to Bridgeport on Saturdays, the operations manager who still packs lunches, until we are the least interesting rich people in America. It works, Damian. It's how the smart families do it. It takes about a year of being relentlessly boring, and it requires something from you that I have no right to ask. Ask it anyway. Don't run." Her voice cracked on it. "That's what tonight is, isn't it? That's the question under the question. Some part of you is standing in this kitchen doing the math you do, and the math says the safest version of Ava's life is the version without me in it. And you're right. It is the same way the safest version of a life is one where you never love anything. You taught me that. 2 nights ago in the dark, you taught me that. And now, I'm handing it back to you." She pressed her palm flat against his chest, over the place where he'd told Ava the fire lived. "So I'm asking you not to make the decision tonight with that photograph still glowing on your phone. Make it Saturday. Make it after you've watched me fix this, not heard me promise to. Judge me the way you'd judge anyone in your warehouse on the work." For a long moment, Damian said nothing. Then he exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to carry 6 years out with it, and he covered her hand with his own. "You want to know the real reason I asked you that question the hard way," he said. "It wasn't a test of whether you could protect her. It was a test of whether you'd lie to me about it. Michelle and I had one rule that outranked all the others. No pretty lies. Not even kind ones. not even to protect each other. If you had stood in this kitchen and promised me nothing bad would ever reach my daughter, I'd have driven you to the airport myself, because a person who lies to comfort you will lie about anything eventually." He shook his head slowly. "You just stood in the worst moment we've had and told me the truth when the truth was the one thing that might cost you everything. So no, Victoria, I'm not running. But we do this like a family does it, which means Ruth is at the table for every decision, and Ava gets told the truth in 6-year-old words tomorrow by both of us, because she is going to hear about that photo eventually, and she is going to hear it from us first." Victoria nodded, and then she did something she had never once done in her adult life, which was let somebody watch her fall apart from relief, standing in a small kitchen in Bridgeport, with flowers still on her sleeve. The machine, as promised, was good. The photograph was down by 2 in the morning. By Tuesday, the site had issued a retraction and a settlement offer. By Friday, Priya had the photographer's name, and the name led to an agency, and the agency, upon learning whose window its man had been aimed through, dropped him with a public statement about standards it had never previously been known to possess. Eleanor Sterling made 4 phone calls that week that no one ever heard the contents of, and afterward, 2 of the largest gossip outlets in the country quietly added the Brooks family to an internal list that editors referred to as radioactive. And on Saturday morning, Victoria Sterling's car pulled up in front of the house in Bridgeport at 9 o'clock exactly, and a 6-year-old was waiting on the porch with a spatula, because pancakes wasn't a one-time thing. It was a whole thing you had to keep doing. They told Ava about the photograph together at the kitchen table in 6-year-old words. Damian explained that a stranger had taken a picture without asking, and that taking pictures of people without asking was wrong, and that the grown-ups had made it stop. Ava listened with her forensic eyes moving between the two of them, and then she asked the question neither adult had prepared for. "Was it because of you?" she said to Victoria. Not cruelly, just true, the way she was always true. The kitchen went very still, and Damian started to speak, and Victoria touched his arm and stopped him, because this one was hers. "Yes," Victoria said. "It was because of me. Because a lot of people know who I am, and some of them will do wrong things to find out about the people I love. That's a real thing about my life, Ava, and you deserve to know it, because it's a little bit about your life now too. And here's the other real thing. I have a lot of money and a lot of lawyers and a very scary mother, and every single one of those things now works for you. Anybody who wants to bother you has to get through all of it, and then through your dad, and then through Grandma Ruth, and honestly, nobody's making it past Grandma Ruth." Ava considered this at length. "Your mom is scary. Terrifying. She once made a grown man leave a party using only her voice. Can I meet her?" And that was how 3 weeks later, Eleanor Sterling came to be seated at a kitchen table in Bridgeport in a Chanel jacket being taught the flip. She ruined 5 pancakes. On the 6th, Ava pronounced her almost okay, and Eleanor Sterling, who had not been graded on anything by anyone in 50 years, looked as pleased as either of her children had ever seen her. And later on the porch, she stood beside Damian and watched through the window as Victoria and Ava argued companionably about the correct amount of syrup. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Brooks," Eleanor said. "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Sterling." "I owe you an apology," she repeated in the tone of a woman not accustomed to saying things twice. "Because when this began, I ran your background the same night Richard did. Earlier, probably. I saw a man with a modest salary and a large need, and I made the same assumption he made, and the only difference between Richard Cole and me is that I had the decency to wait for evidence before acting on it." She kept her eyes on the window. "My daughter laughed 4 times during breakfast. I counted because I have been counting for years, and the previous record was 1. Whatever you are not what I assumed, and I am old enough to say so plainly. Also, your mother-in-law makes better coffee than my housekeeper, and I intend to tell her so, and I expect we shall become friends, which should frighten everyone." It did. Ruth and Eleanor became over the following months an alliance that both families came to regard with a mixture of delight and terror, 2 widows from opposite ends of the American experience, who discovered they shared an identical philosophy on grief, grandchildren, and the uselessness of men who wouldn't say what they meant. They sat together at Ava's school recital in the fall Chanel next to Sears, and when a parent 2 rows back whispered too loudly about which grandmother was the billionaire, Ruth turned around and said, The one who can't make pancakes. And Eleanor laughed so hard she had to leave during the second-grade choir. The year of being relentlessly boring worked just as Victoria had promised. There was a flurry at the beginning. The gala footage had made them famous for a news cycle. The proposal by shareholder approval line got printed on coffee mugs by strangers. And for a few months, every drive to Bridgeport involved Victoria's security team and a decoy car. But the family gave the lenses nothing. No red carpets, no magazine spreads, no exclusive interviews. Victoria Sterling ran her company, and her numbers stayed the best in its history, and the board, that had once called her personal life a liability, now discovered that the market found a CEO with a family in Bridgeport, reassuring in a way no arranged engagement could have manufactured a fact. Julian pointed out at a board meeting with such relish that his mother had to formally ask him to stop. Damian kept his job and kept his terms. He submitted to the hardest performance reviews of anyone at his level in writing exactly as he'd demanded and passed them all. And when a promotion finally came 18 months in, it came with a file of documentation thick enough that not even the warehouse cynics could call it carried. He still drove the Honda for another year until Ava staged an intervention on the grounds that the heater took too long, and even then he replaced it with a sensible one, and Victoria never once said a word about it because she had learned by then that the sensible car was not stubbornness. It was the same thing as the pillow wall and the terms on the terrace. It was a man keeping hold of the person his daughter needed him to stay. Victoria learned the flip. It took her 11 Saturdays. On the 12th, she executed it unassisted, a perfect rotation, and Ava declared her fully certified and presented her with a construction paper diploma that Victoria had framed, actually framed professionally in museum glass, and hung in her office at Sterling Technologies between 2 awards from national business publications, and when visiting executives asked about it, she told them the truth that it was the most difficult certification she held. She learned other things too. Slower things. She learned to come to the small events, the recitals, the parent nights, the Saturday morning soccer games where she stood on a muddy sideline in $800 boots that were never the same again, and screamed herself hoarse over a scoreless tie. She learned that when Ava called her at the office, the call got taken board meeting, or no board meeting, and the board learned it too. And after the second time, Victoria paused a quarterly review to give a considered opinion on a diorama. No one so much as checked their watch because the numbers were still the best in company history, and everyone had finally figured out that the two facts were related. And she learned the hardest thing last. It happened on a Tuesday in the spring, almost a year in, when Ava got her heart broken by the small betrayals of the second grade. A best friend who chose someone else, the ancient story, and cried at the kitchen table. And Damian was still 40 minutes away in warehouse traffic, and Ruth was at a doctor's appointment, and it was Victoria there early for dinner, who found herself alone with a weeping 7-year-old, and no machine to deploy, no lawyer to call, nothing to purchase, nothing to fix. So she did the only thing she knew, which was the thing Damian had done for her in the dark. She sat down next to the crying and stayed in it. She didn't manage it, or solve it, or perform around it. She held a small hand and said, "This is awful, and you're right to be sad, and I'm not going anywhere." And when Damian finally came through the door, he found the two of them on the couch, Ava asleep against Victoria's shoulder, with the exhausted heaviness of a child who had been fully heard, and Victoria pinned underneath her one arm, dead unwilling to move it. And she looked up at him with an expression he recognized instantly, because he had worn it himself for 6 years. "I understand now," she whispered, so as not to wake the child. "The thing you said in the kitchen, about the fear, about how there's no going back to the office. Told you. You didn't tell me it would feel like this." "There aren't words for how it feels," Damian said. "There's just this. You're in it now. I'm in it now." Victoria agreed, and her voice broke on it quietly. And Damian sat down on the other side of his sleeping daughter, and the three of them stayed like that until the room went dark and nobody was afraid of it. The wedding happened in October, 2 years, almost to the week after a storm had canceled half the rooms at a lakeside resort. They held it at the same resort Victoria's idea executed with a vengeance, and the guest list was 110 people, which Priya described as the most brutal negotiation of her career. The board was not invited. The press was not invited. The manager who had once apologized for the single remaining room was invited personally by name and spent the reception being toasted by strangers and telling the story of the night with escalating dramatic detail until by his final telling, he had practically arranged the marriage himself. Ruth walked Damian down the aisle because he had asked her to, and because when he asked her, she had cried into her dish towel for 10 minutes and then said, "Michelle would want eyes on you the whole way, and I'm the eyes." Eleanor walked Victoria, and if anyone thought it strange that the bride's mother wore an expression usually reserved for military honors, no one said so. Julian officiated, having gotten ordained on the internet specifically for the occasion, and opened the ceremony with, "2 years ago, my sister hired an employee to pretend to love her, and it remains the only bad deal she's ever made because she wildly overpaid. He'd have done it for free within the week, and had to wait a full minute for the laughter to settle." But the vows belonged to the flower girl. Ava was 8 by then, and she had lobbied for a speaking role with the persistence of a lobbyist, and Damian and Victoria had finally agreed she could say something short after the rings. She walked to the front in her small blue dress with a folded piece of notebook paper she had permitted no adult to review, unfolded it with great ceremony, and read, "When my dad told me about Victoria, I asked if he had to stop loving my mommy, and he said love is like fire, and when you light a new fire, the old fire doesn't get smaller, there's just more light in the house." She looked up from the paper at the 110 faces entirely unafraid. "I checked for 2 years because I check things. He was right. Our house is really, really bright now. That's all. You can do the kissing part." They did the kissing part. And Damian Brooks holding his wife in front of everyone who mattered, and no one who didn't. Thought about the elevator ride 2 years ago, the 4 minutes he'd spent trying to figure out what he'd done wrong, and understood finally that the answer had been nothing, that he had done everything right for 6 brutal years, every lunch packed and every bill juggled and every night alone, and the world had simply taken its time paying attention. There was one more moment later that never made it into any of the stories people told about them. It came at the very end of the reception past midnight, when the band had gone home, and Ava was asleep across 2 chairs under Julian's jacket, and the staff was folding tablecloths. Victoria took her husband's hand and led him out to the terrace, and they stood at the railing where she had once told him. She kept forgetting which parts were fake, and the lake was black glass under a clear sky, and the power everywhere was on. "I want to tell you the real numbers," Victoria said. "Just once out loud so they exist somewhere outside my head. 2 years ago, I was worth $11 billion, and I had a recurring dream about my own funeral, where the eulogy was given by an investor and the first row was empty. I haven't had that dream in 20 months. My company is worth more now than it was then, which everyone finds fascinating. And it is the 4th or 5th most interesting thing in my life, which no one would believe. I have a mother. I actually talk to a brother who calls for no reason. A mother-in-law who taught me to make gravy and told me about a music teacher from 1979 that I'm sworn never to mention, and a daughter." Her voice caught, and she let it because she had learned to let it. "A daughter who checked for 2 years because she checks things and decided I could stay. And a husband," Damian said. "And a husband who cost me 1 weekend's contract fee and every wall I ever built." She turned to face him. "People still think you were the lucky one, you know. I hear it. The operations manager who married the billionaire. They say it like you won something. Let them. Ava learned that one before kindergarten. What people say from the cheap seats doesn't move the game. But I need you to know that I know the truth." Victoria took both his hands the way he had taken hers on a terrace 2 years ago, when everything was about to catch fire. "Every morning I wake up in a house full of light next to a man who wanted nothing from me. Nothing in a world where everyone wanted everything, and who taught a woman with $11 billion, the only thing she couldn't afford, which is that you don't have to earn being cared about. I was drowning in that dark, Damian, elegantly, profitably, invisibly drowning, and you held my hand like it was nothing, like it was free, and it turned out to be the single most valuable transaction of my entire life. So no, you were never the lucky one. I was. I am. It's not close, and I'll spend the next 50 years proving the math." Damian looked at his wife for a long moment there on the terrace above the black water, and then he laughed softly from all the way down, the laugh that had once stopped her cold through a hotel room phone call. "You know what's funny?" he said. 2 years ago, your assistant told me to go straight in, and I walked into your office absolutely certain I was about to lose everything. My job, my footing, my careful little life. And I was right. I did lose it. Every bit of that small, guarded, half-alive life I'd built to survive gone. And what I got instead was a wife who's scared of thunderstorms, a terrifying mother-in-law I'd take a bullet for, a daughter who runs due process on everyone we love, and a house so bright you can see it from the street." He pulled her close, and behind them, through the glass, they could see Ruth gathering Ava up off the chairs, and Eleanor holding the little girl's shoes, and Julian holding the door. "The whole world got the story wrong, Victoria. They keep calling it a fake engagement that turned real. It was never fake. Not for one single day. We just didn't know yet that we were telling the truth. Because in the end, that was the whole of it. The thing the tabloids could never print and the boardrooms could never price. A woman who owned everything had spent her life buying proof she mattered, and a man who had lost everything had spent his life proving it for free. And one storm, one room, and one bed had forced them close enough to see what the whole watching world had missed, that love was never in the contract, the money, or the name. It was in the hand that reaches across the dark and holds on, asking for nothing, promising everything, and never ever letting go.